once you conceptually wrap your head around the idea, or I guess the fact that Bitcoin will continue to appreciate ad infinitum, then you're never too late. All the productivity gains are going to be captured by the hardest asset, and humans are going to continue to innovate forever. That's never going to stop. I think the biggest barrier to people understanding Bitcoin is feeling dumb. And that comes from the educational side of people trying to sound smart.
Yeah.
So there's this just complete disconnect. And I completely fell into that trap early on too. The main message is don't focus on trying to sound smart. You know, do the work necessary to understand it deeply, but then just communicate it as simply as possible.
This podcast is entertainment, not financial, tax, or legal advice. Views expressed represent statements of the speaker in their individual capacity, do not represent the views of Unchained, and should not be considered investment advice. Speakers often have personal, family, or business connections to Unchained, which may include direct financial benefits. Please see our disclosure at unchained.com/podcast.
Anil, thanks so much for taking the time to sit down with us and record.
Joe, thank you. Live from Vegas, Bitcoin Frontier podcast. I'm psyched.
Yep. Glad to have you on. I want to hear like your Bitcoin origin story. Like what were you doing before Bitcoin and how did you get into Bitcoin?
So this goes back pretty far, but it's how I got first introduced to digital scarcity. And my opinion is that existed before Bitcoin. I'll tell you why.
Okay.
So when I was a kid, I was really into live music. Went to a lot of shows, and I actually started a ticket brokerage business. So this is back in the day before digital tickets, right? So you're lining up at box offices, you're getting a physical ticket, and you're going to a show. Anyway, fast forward, here comes the internet, digital revolution, and now you have digital tickets to shows. Now, if you think of it from a scarcity perspective, so take an arena with 21,000 seats. There's 21,000 tickets that can be sold. That's verifiable. You can actually look at an arena, see all the seats, count them. And that was my introduction to markets, like supply and demand dynamics. But when tickets went digital, now you have a digital good that trades in a market at a price that you can exchange peer-to-peer with others. So 10, 20 years later, when, I finally get introduced to Bitcoin, I'm like, oh, I've seen this before. I kind of get this. At first, I mistook it for a payments technology, which, Bitcoin admittedly is as well. But I was very fortunate to have that early introduction to digital scarcity.
So like when you first heard about Bitcoin, do you remember like where you heard about it or what you were reading at the time and or who you were reading from or listening to?
Yeah. I was sitting on the floor of my parents' house. So I must have been visiting them, and a family friend was telling me about it. I'm thinking, okay, that's pretty interesting. And this particular person had been very early to a lot of other trends. They were very early to the digitization of music. So they'd been telling me about MP3s are going to completely destroy the, CD industry. I'm like, okay, sure. I was right about that. And a few other things. So when he'd mentioned Bitcoin, I was like, okay, I should probably take note of this. I looked it up a few days later. I think it was maybe trading at $90 at the time on, one of those smaller exchanges that doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And then a few weeks, maybe months later, I saw the price was like $110. And then I was like, oh, I missed it. Put it out of mind. So, it'd be years later till I would actually start to take it seriously. But that was my first introduction.
Interesting. Were you, so you initially were skeptical and you thought you were too late to Bitcoin, despite it being only $110.
Yeah, because it cracked 3 digits.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, if something moves up from $90 to $110 on a percentage basis, that's significant.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, maybe that's it.
Yeah.
Maybe that's it. Maybe that's done.
One thing that's kind of interesting to me today is like, now Bitcoin's above $100,000, and I would still argue like global adoption is still very small. Like most people don't hold a significant amount of Bitcoin. What would you say to someone that today is like, oh, well, you were worried about 3 digits being late. Well, now it's, 6 digits and I feel like I'm late. What would you say to them now?
It's a long conversation, but it all comes back to it's going up forever. Laura.
Yeah.
Once you conceptually wrap your head around the idea, or I guess the fact that Bitcoin will continue to appreciate ad infinitum, then you're never too late, right?
Yeah.
There is no end point
Yeah.
at which this thing plateaus.
Yeah.
Because when I break it down into two kind of periods of Bitcoin's growth, the first is the monetization of Bitcoin as an asset. So that's draining the monetary premium that exists in all these other assets around the world. And then the second piece is when you understand that all the productivity gains are going to be captured by the hardest asset. And humans are going to continue to innovate forever. That's never going to stop. So number go up.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I'm curious, did you watch the Peter Schiff and Trace Merritt all yesterday or no?
I caught the tail end of that.
Yeah.
Yep.
I guess I want to hear your perspective on this. Like, I think one thing that Peter kind of critiques about Bitcoin is like, there's no use case beyond a monetary use case, or like Bitcoin only has a monetary premium. And I guess coming from your background with the digital tickets and physical tickets, you know, like obviously a ticket can get you into a concert or sporting event or whatnot.
Yeah.
And Bitcoin is like, it's just good money. Was that a hurdle for you at all? Like, just, you know, that there's not like an event to go to when you buy your Bitcoin or something else like that?
Yeah, I guess a ticket trades like an option, right? It expires at a certain date, at which point the value plummets to zero.
Yeah.
But before that point, I remember in high school, you know, I was working as a ticket broker, and my friends had, you know, jobs at fast food restaurants or clothing stores, and they're saving their dollars in a bank account. And in my mind, I'm like, what are you doing? You should put that into 2-floor tickets to Radiohead. They're only going to do one show. That's going to significantly outperform your 5% at the bank.
Yeah.
So that was my store of value, right? And it's the same with any asset, as long as you have access to it.
Yeah.
But going back to like the Peter Schiff point, I tend to discount his opinion because I think he understands that he's just playing a character. He's playing a role within this industry, which is a very useful role.
Yeah.
Because you need the other side of that debate.
Agree.
But, you know, maybe it was 6-7 years ago now, at a conference, I gave Peter a Bitcoin hardware wallet, and he's had every opportunity to understand this. So now I'm of the opinion that he's just playing a role.
Really interesting. So you think he's like engagement farming the Bitcoin community to some extent? And he actually gets Bitcoin and holds a significant amount.
I'm not sure about that point, but either way, it's beneficial to him to be on, you know, the main stage in front of 10,000 people, which, you know, if he had just an average view of Bitcoin, that wouldn't be the case.
Yeah, that's a good point. Very interesting. On the topic of like store value and payments, like, how do you think about Bitcoin evolving from here? It's like, obviously, I think a lot of people are using it primarily as a store of value. Steak and Shake was like a big thing recently, where people are going and spending their Bitcoin at Steak and Shake. I did that. I don't know if they have Steak and Shake in Canada. Maybe not.
We don't. Not yet. One day when they acquire Wendy's and McDonald's because they're Bitcoin treasury, then we will.
I love that. How do you see like the store of value narrative evolving alongside the payments narrative?
Joe, you've had way smarter people on your show than me, so I'm not even going to try to tackle that. But both of those things, I think, are going to develop in parallel. I mean, you just kind of take yourself, for example, like, what do you personally use Bitcoin as or see it as? There are going to be more people out there like you. You know, I love to think of myself as very average in intelligence, and there are a lot of other people out there. So whatever I believe or think or I'm reading, there's probably going to be millions of others doing the exact same thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Fair. Is there anything in the ticket brokerage industry that you learned about markets or about payments or whatnot that is like somewhat counterintuitive that like helped you? Like you brought up a little bit about how it helped you understand Bitcoin. Was there anything else there?
Yeah, so that was very early in my teenage years.
Yeah.
At which point I realized, I actually wanted to break into the music industry. So I ended up going to work for a lot of the promoters that were putting on these big shows, and almost explaining to them how they could solve the problem of, say, ticket scalpers as it became more of a mainstream issue with these digital platforms and the, you know, evolution of ticket bots where people could buy up large chunks. So I was pitching all these promoters, here's the solution. Here's how you solve this problem. It's always going to exist. You need to bring it in-house, and then you can capture the fees multiple times, and you provide a safe space for people to transact. Now, I'm talking about a centralized platform.
Yeah.
A lot of Bitcoiners out there not cool with that. But that experience helped me avoid a lot of the pitfalls that people go down when they look at the altcoin route
Yeah.
of we're gonna tokenize this or that. And I'm not an expert in any of those fields, but I understand ticketing.
Yeah.
And I got pitched a lot of startups in that space. And, you know, they're trying to sell the solution of decentralization as a solution, where in that particular application, that is the last thing you want. You know, if people lose their tickets, their private key, you want a centralized authority to go to and say, hey, I gave you this money for this experience. I need your help. There's no reason to decentralize that particular application. So
you may not have a good answer to this, but I've always been curious, like when you buy a ticket on StubHub or whatever, like the fees are outrageous. Is it because like it's just a centralized institution that is, you know, issuing those tickets? Is there ever hope that we'll be able to buy a concert and not pay like $50 of fees?
Not in our lifetime, that I believe. And again, it goes back to, it just naturally centralizes. So Fred Rosen, the guy who started Ticketmaster, back in the day, he realized very early on, oh, if I can capture exclusive agreements with all these arenas, because we're in Vegas right now, there are, you know, maybe 2 stadiums, 2 arenas that a large act could potentially play at. If you have the exclusive rights to those venues, you can do whatever you want. You're the only game in town. So Fred Rosen, what he did early on is he was going to all these venues and offering them cash up front. And on the back end of the ticket, he was adding a fee, a service fee or a facility fee. You can name it whatever you want. The money's all going into that pot. And then he would basically give them a kickback.
Yeah.
So it was in everyone's interest to add on all these layers of fees.
Interesting. That makes sense. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this one. Like as a Canadian, like the U.S. National Strategic Bitcoin Reserve is obviously like big news in America. Like what is your perspective on that?
So fundamentally, I think the most important thing is you should have an individual Bitcoin reserve. You should have one for your family. And if your loved ones aren't yet on board, maybe even consider starting one for them that you maybe hand over once in the future. They come to understand this. At a federal level, I don't really have an opinion. I would say it's favorable in the sense that if your government holds Bitcoin, you're likely to have greater protections as an individual holding Bitcoin, because there is less incentive for government to ever seize, confiscate, or excessively tax you as a citizen, because the state's coffers will experience greater growth in purchasing power alongside your citizens.
Yeah.
And that's ideal, right? Everyone's getting wealthier. Everyone's quality of life is increasing.
Yeah. Do you think Canada will ever get a strategic Bitcoin reserve, or maybe a city in Canada, if not the country?
I would say it's probably a few years behind the US. The great thing about Bitcoin is, you know, it can happen at different levels, municipal level, state level. In Canada, those are provinces. So, you know, where I'm from in Vancouver, the city of Vancouver has been looking at that. The mayor was actually orange pilled by Jeff Booth, who was also from Vancouver. He wrote the foreword to my book. And he gets it. He understands. So he obviously has a lot of hurdles to get through to explain to all his other counselors like what he's trying to do. And you know, hopefully later this year there'll be some news, but we'll see.
Yeah. I feel like there's like 2 interesting trends right now. It's like the national, or not national, but like cities accumulating Bitcoin, states accumulating Bitcoin, US accumulating Bitcoin, El Salvador, and then you also have like the Bitcoin treasury companies. Like that's another kind of interesting phenomenon that's happening. Do you have a perspective on the Bitcoin treasury company phenomenon right now?
I think it's wonderful in the sense that, you know, imagine a physical pile of Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And just all these different vacuum cleaners just hoovering it up, right? From all these different angles. And the amount they're taking is continually changing. And more vacuums are coming to that pile. So there is just this insatiable demand pipeline that is being built. And then, you know, you tack on the ETFs, you tack on the indexes that these treasury companies are being added to. And it just becomes very obvious what direction Bitcoin's price will go in the future. Yeah, I've never made a price prediction. I don't plan to, but I'll definitely make a directional prediction. And that is, I don't think the 200-week moving average will ever go down.
Yeah, I agree. I think the number is going to go up for sure. What do you think about MBAs in Bitcoin? Like, it seems like a lot of people in traditional finance or people that are running large corporations, like they're still very slow to even grasp Bitcoin, even if they just recently got their MBA and like they're still relatively young. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I'll give you my sad story.
Okay.
Pull out your little violin here. So 11 years ago, I pitched Bitcoin to my MBA class. Not that they should buy it, but just how to buy it if they wished to.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, I think Bitcoin was $580, around that. To this day, I think I know of about 4, maybe 5 that own a non-zero amount of Bitcoin.
Wow.
So I spent about a decade working on these people. Lovely people.
Yeah.
Kind, intelligent, some of my best friends. Absolutely no criticism of them. But business school is a place you go to reduce your risk. You're picking a particular path, right? You're trying to get a credential to go into certain, middle management positions. You're not looking to take a huge amount of risk. Now, you and I have a very different understanding of Bitcoin as risky versus, say, a traditional MBA. Cool thing is, though, there are a lot of MBAs in Bitcoin now. And they're usually like the exception in their class.
Mm-hmm.
So Bitcoiners are everywhere, but I think business schools and the education that they provide, it's geared less towards something like Bitcoin.
Yeah.
That's changing. This wave of adoption, I think we're seeing more corporates, more government interest, more of the traditional finance industry. So I think that group as a cohort, they're going to get orange pilled this cycle as they get a tap on the shoulder from their boss, basically saying, hey, it's time to look into this.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. It's like people that go and get their MBA or like go the traditional route, like follow all the steps to be a high achiever. It's like you're doing everything to follow the path that's been written by people before you. And it's like, you're not going to try to stray away from that, even if it's something is very logical. Like, in my opinion, I think Bitcoin's very logical, but it's so new and unconventional, and older people above you say it's like, that's crazy. Like, what are you doing? You're stupid if you're even involved with that. And so it kind of makes sense as to why they're slow to adopt Bitcoin, I guess.
Yeah. And business schools naturally filter out people like us.
Yeah.
So I worked in the admissions side of business school education after I got my MBA, and I would get to travel the world. And you basically got a pot of scholarship money, and you're trying to attract the cream of the crop to come to your business school. So what are you looking for? Are you looking for someone who's a bit zany, a bit on the edge, started a few companies that didn't work out, which on paper is exactly what you would want for, say, an entrepreneur who might do quite well in the future. So yeah, business schools just aren't geared towards accepting people who think outside of the box so much.
Yeah.
Maybe that's changed now, but wasn't the case back then.
Yeah. So you think that, you said like this cycle, it might change to where the MBAs actually might start to understand Bitcoin. Can you kind of elaborate on like the exact catalyst of like why you think that will be the case?
Yep. So, okay. My business school cohort, they're now in very senior positions across government, utilities, banks. Okay. You now have this wave of Bitcoin treasury adoption. Okay. What are all the services required to facilitate a company doing that? You need banking services. You need insurance. You might need regulatory approval depending on where you are. So it's at this point, you cannot ignore it. And if you're at a company that's being outperformed by a Bitcoin treasury company, well, you now need to look into this.
Stop asking how to value Bitcoin. Start asking how to value everything else in Bitcoin. I recently co-authored a new report from Unchained and Strive, Vivek Ramaswamy's asset management firm. It's called Repricing the Economy in Bitcoin, and it introduces a new framework that changes how we value everything. Read it now at unchained.com/frontier. That's unchained.com/frontier.
So it's just a matter of time.
Yeah. That makes sense. What do you think like their biggest hurdle is? Like obviously it's perceived to be risky. Maybe that's partially because of the volatility. If they like took the time to like have like a formal debate about it, what would they say? Like your opinion, like which negative aspect of what they perceive to be Bitcoin trips them up? Do you think?
I think it's a lack of time. I
Okay.
think if you take the average business school graduate today, so you're coming out of school, you have a mountain of debt,
Yeah.
you may want to start a family, housing's fairly unaffordable depending on which city you're in. So in your mind, you have a list of 5 or 6 things that take priority over this.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't tell you how many copies of the Bitcoin Standard I've given out that are sitting on people's shelves getting dusty. And it comes down to people who just simply, in their mind, don't have the time to step away, reassess the world. I got lucky because when I worked at a business school, I got to talk to a lot of professors at different universities, and the curtain kind of got pulled back for me,
Mm-hmm.
especially in terms of understanding economics. So I did very poorly in economics in business school, and I couldn't understand why. I'm like, I've run profitable businesses, I've worked in all these different industries. Why am I not getting this? And that was when I understood there's a difference. There's different schools of economic thought. One is very logical and one is illogical, but universities must teach that because you can't bite the hand that feeds you in a system where government is the largest source of funding for a university.
Yeah. What's so like talking to those professors and specifically in regards to Bitcoin, like where do you think they get tripped up on Bitcoin?
I think it was back to risk.
Yeah.
Yes, there was no incentive for them to take that risk. Now, as they're reassessing the lives that their children or grandchildren might have, and maybe they're looking at their own pensions, and maybe seeing what's happening with government bonds, they're forced to reassess, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's definitely interesting because like I feel like on its face, like once you grasp Bitcoin, it's fairly simple, right? Like it's money that can't be debased and it's censorship resistant. No one can really take it from you. It's like, okay, well, we have all of these other monetary tools out there that exist that can be debased and are actively being debased. It's like, how hard of a decision is this? Like, are you surprised that it has taken this long for adoption to slowly keep growing over time, or are we approaching a suddenly moment for Bitcoin?
I mean, you've probably been walking around the strip the last few days, and you see a lot of people who are maybe just going about their business, playing the slots,
Yeah.
wanting to see the latest show. I don't think the average person thinks too deeply about these things.
Yeah.
I think their allocation to Bitcoin is going to come because they're buying an index that their financial advisor tells them to, that just has now been penetrated by Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So I think most people will continue to be unaware, but indirectly through either their government, through their employer, through their bank, will have exposure to Bitcoin.
Yeah. I want to hear your thoughts on like your view of Bitcoin education. Like one, I guess, like how has it evolved since you got into Bitcoin? Because I think Bitcoin education has gotten way better over the last 7 or 8 years since I've personally been in Bitcoin. I've been in even longer. It's like, so how do you think about it? Like from the beginning to where it is now?
Yeah. Early on, I kept coming across these amazing resources and I would share them with people and it would just kind of hit a wall. So early on, my role I saw as being a curator. Like, hey, you're starting your journey. Rather than me explain to you what I think you should know, here are 4 or 5 of the best resources I've come across over several years, and here is the order in which you should read them, because that matters. The sequence of steps really matters. So early on, it was just purely curation from my side.
Nice.
And then I started creating content wherever I saw a gap. Like, oh, from getting someone from this step to this step of like cognitive understanding, they need to see this piece. So, okay, I'm just going to make it. And then, over time, I just kept pumping out content specific to education because, you attract the audience based on the content you put out.
Yeah.
And most people, when they first come into Bitcoin, you're seeing a lot of price predictions, whatever, giveaways, scams. Like, if you go that route, you might have a big audience, but the quality of people is going to be incredibly low.
Yeah.
So,
when you were curating those original like Bitcoin educational pieces, like who were you pulling from? Was there anyone in particular that you were like really liked?
Oh, Pierre Rochard,
Yeah.
Tony Meester, a number of people you've had on your show. And the cool thing is, Bitcoiners are so open. They're very friendly if you show respect. So, one essay series that was really foundational to my own understanding was Parker Lewis's Gradually Then Suddenly series. And, I know people who only read books.
Yeah.
Like they won't read an essay. They're not going to watch a YouTube video. They will only read a book because that is the bar for them. But someone's taking the time to put this into a book. So I hassled Parker for ages. Like, hey, turn these essays into a book. And one day he finally said, sure. And so I got to do that with him. So sometimes, there's very little I can say that hasn't been said, right, already by, Pierre or Michael Goldstein or whoever. But sometimes just putting content into a different medium or format just opens you up to a whole new audience.
Yeah. One thing that you've done well that I've noticed is like you create really good graphics that explain a lot of these complex ideas in a very simple, relatable way. And like obviously Michael Saylor has included in some of your slides or the graphics that you've created on his own keynote presentations, which is obviously pretty cool. How do you go about thinking about which graphics to create and how you relay that information to your audience?
It just goes back to what hasn't been created, because previously anytime a question would come up, I'd be like, oh, who explained this the best? It was the best explanation of this, and that was always getting upgraded, right?
Yep.
And whenever there was a gap, it was like, okay, someone needs to create it, and that's when I would look to go and create something.
Yeah.
And a big part of Bitcoin being a grassroots movement, there are hundreds of meetups all over the world, and people are giving presentations every hour of the day about Bitcoin. And public speaking is hard. It's not easy. So if you can solve the issue of, slides for someone, like, hey, here is a set of slides that walks through this particular aspect of Bitcoin step by step. You just have to walk them through it, do a little bit of talking. That removes a huge hurdle for someone.
Yeah. Were you surprised? Did you know like Saylor was going to use some of the stuff that you've created in his slides before he presented it publicly?
No, I did not. So I'm working on a book about Michael Saylor, kind of taking a lot of his interviews, podcasts, lectures he's given, and condensing that material into a book. Because in my opinion, there are some exceptional communicators in Bitcoin. Michael has been the one to come up with the analogies and, almost catchphrases that seem to spread the furthest. So, working on a book about Michael's content, it just seemed like the highest use of my time.
Yeah, that's a great point. I still remember like 2020, I think it was maybe like August or July of 2020 when they put out the press release. It's like a random company, MicroStrategy, is like, we're considering adopting Bitcoin as a treasury reserve asset. And I remember like at the time, like no one realized like how big of a deal that would be in hindsight. I don't know, like, do you happen to remember like the early days of MicroStrategy and like when Saylor came on and started and really began talking about Bitcoin publicly for the first time?
Yeah. So he started following me on Twitter early on.
Nice.
Because he was trying to find inspiration. Well, hang on. And my first opinion of him was like, oh, this guy doesn't know anything because he's not following, the the Pierres, the Parkers, Caitlin Long, all these people. I mean, obviously he is now.
Yeah.
But I was thinking, I wonder how this is going to go.
Yeah.
As I went deeper and read like The Mobile Wave, the book he wrote in 2012, 2013, he kind of laid out the case of these dominant digital networks, which turned out to become kind of like the Mag 7 FANG stocks. So he was already perfectly primed to understand Bitcoin.
Yeah.
He even talks about digital payments and digital money in The Mobile Wave.
Yeah.
So in my opinion, it was always going to be him. And you keep layering on his understanding of history and like his encyclopedic memory. It was just a matter of time.
Yeah. I think he was like, wasn't he a big domain name guy too? So he kind of like grasped, similar to tickets with you, like he grasped the digital scarcity aspect.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, there's a great story of him, I think, selling the domain name voice.com for, I don't know, 30 or 40 million bucks.
Yeah.
And that was his first introduction to the crypto world,
Yeah.
where I think he raised his eyebrows a bit. Thought, oh, hang on a second, there is a bit of capital in this area. There's something going on. How can they afford to pay me that much for this domain name? So
Yeah. It's crazy to think about. Going back to like, people getting introduced to Bitcoin and like, adopting it as a form of savings technology. I've always thought that like a lot of the early Bitcoin adopters like have similar characteristics, like libertarian, small government minded, like have a technology background as well, maybe interested in like finance or just investing in general. And it's like, it feels like it's happening slow sometimes, but then it's also like, it's kind of happening like how you would expect it to happen. Like if you're like really thought about it. Do you agree with that or no?
I do. So my great appreciation for Bitcoin came after, my wife likes to call it like my eat, pray, love. I took like a year out of my life when around the time we met to go and travel the world and like meet family around the world and actually like ask questions about my own family.
Yeah.
And it was understanding like my dad, he grew up in Uganda, and as a teenager, one day there was a change of government and you kind of got a 30-day notice of, okay, everyone of this particular ethnicity, pack your bags, you're out. And that's not a unique story. Every family, if you go back enough generations, will have that story. And I would encourage everyone to go back and like learn that, because then you get an appreciation for having mobility of person, mobility of capital. And that will really set off that. There are many light bulb moments in Bitcoin, but for me, that's like the main one, which is sovereignty over your wealth.
Yeah, that makes sense. Nowadays, like with Bitcoin, I think a lot of people are getting into Bitcoin and they're, maybe buying Bitcoin ETFs or they're buying Bitcoin treasury companies. Like, how do you contrast that with like the original ethos of Bitcoin is like monetary sovereignty is something that's really important versus chasing the number going up? Yeah. How do you compare those two? And like, do you think it's important that people think about the monetary sovereignty aspect?
Yeah, well, I live in Canada now, and obviously many people, many of your listeners will have heard of, the stuff that happened with the truckers.
Yeah.
And that's not unusual in probably, more than half the countries in the world recognize this issue, that a government or a group can turn off access to your wealth with a flip of the switch.
Yeah.
No recourse, maybe no due legal process. So read enough history and that becomes very obvious. So yeah, when you understand that, you will always want to have some Bitcoin in self-custody as a form of insurance should the worst happen.
Like thinking about this idea of monetary sovereignty and self-custody, it's like, I think people in the past have learned about it via like errors like Mt. Gox or BlockFi, Celsius. It's like, one, do you think that we'll still have events like that where custodians like go bankrupt or governments crack down and they're like, oh, wait a second, I don't actually have my Bitcoin. I thought I did, but I don't. Do you think that will happen? Or do you think like we're progressing in this like, BlackRock, or take Fidelity, I guess, for example, like Fidelity has their own keys or however they want to do their own custody. Is like, are they, I would say that like they're probably less inclined to make a mistake than Mt. Gox, but they're still, it's still a single point of failure and there's still potentially errors that could be made. Like, how do you see that evolving, over the next 10 years? Will we see like another crazy Mt. Gox, or is it going to be a little more stable going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I spent about a year investigating lots of scams, specifically Ponzi schemes and pyramid schemes for a period. I gave a series of talks around that. And the sad reality is they will always continue to exist because, as you said, there are certain painful experiences someone needs to experience to understand the importance of, say, self-custody or Bitcoin only versus, trying to outperform Bitcoin. And there will always be people chasing greater and greater gains or, be envious of those receiving them. So I'm sure it will continue. The reason you and I are still here is because I think we have a high tolerance for boring.
Yeah.
We're happy to sit there
Yeah.
for years while Bitcoin just chugs along in the background, because we've done the deep fundamental work to understand where this is going long term. It's just low time preference.
Yeah.
Most people don't have that.
Mm.
It's on full display here in Vegas.
Yep.
So unfortunately, more and more people will continue to get burned. Hopefully, pain is information for them, and that serves to be a lesson.
Yeah. When you're curating Bitcoin content or trying to make things like more relatable and understandable for everyday people, what's like one lesson that you've learned over the years of trying to do that? Because there are, like you said, I think like there are hundreds or thousands of other people that are also like trying to explain Bitcoin to like their family or even like their own following or audience or whatnot. Like, is there any advice or tips that you would provide to help them communicate their point better?
Yeah, it all comes down to, I think the biggest barrier to people understanding Bitcoin is feeling dumb. And that comes from the educational side of people trying to sound smart.
Yeah.
So there's this just complete disconnect. And I completely fell into that trap early on too. It was, I wasn't looking to educate people. I was like, I want to sound smart so I can gain the validation of these people I respect. And that was completely like the wrong angle to take. And eventually you kind of have to backtrack and course correct.
Yeah.
So the main message is don't focus on trying to sound smart. Do the work necessary to understand it deeply, but then just communicate it as simply as possible, and then take feedback to, iterate over time. But
I completely agree. And it's like, to some extent, if it takes you an hour to explain a topic and you have to use all these really big words and extreme detail, like specific points, like maybe you don't even necessarily understand exactly what's happening to some extent.
Absolutely. Yeah. And a great way to identify people who don't know what they're talking about is, like you said, if someone's taking an hour to explain something, ask them to explain it in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
And if they can do that, okay, explain it in one sentence.
Yeah.
If they have that level of granularity, then they probably understand it. If they can't, they get tripped up. Red flag.
Yeah. I've heard you talk about this before. Like, you think reading is important for individuals and like it can give you an edge over others, or it's important just for people. Why do you think that is? And can you elaborate on that?
A very clear example that I've noticed over time between Bitcoin and crypto is, on the crypto side, you might see people posting photos of their Rolex, their fancy car, which is leased, by the way. And then on the Bitcoin side, you have Bitcoiners showing off their book collections.
Yeah.
Like, you could not have a greater contrast between two groups.
Mm-hmm.
I listen to, there's a great podcast called Founders. And it's basically this guy who reads the biographies of people who've built amazing companies, and he gives a synopsis. And every episode is based on a book. And now I pretty much exclusively read biographies of founders and then a bit of history. And if you read enough of these books, and these, by the way, are people's life's work, right? Someone started an amazing company, they disrupted an industry, and they took 40 years of, effort and sweat and blood and tears, and they put it into 200 pages, which you can purchase for $10.
Yeah.
That's insane.
Yeah.
You're not going to get better value than that. So it just goes back to like low time preference, right? People listening to this podcast, there are probably going to be people listening to it on 3x speed because they're like, I have 1 hour, I need to listen to 3 hours worth of podcasts. Like, you don't have a time problem, you have a curation problem. You need to get higher up the ladder of quality of what you're consuming.
Mm-hmm.
So if books are amazing because most people do not read, it's the most obvious edge you can have. So, make a habit out of it. Go read books. Lower your time preference. I'm shocked more people aren't avid readers.
Yeah, it's a great point. Do you think that to some extent, it's the age that we live in where people are addicted to, Instagram Reels or TikTok or whatever it might be, and we can't focus for more than like 5 seconds on any one thing?
Absolutely, which makes the payoff even greater for that group who are able to tune out, right? The gap just widens even further.
Mm-hmm. how do you distinguish between like signal and noise, whether you're like reading a book or listening to a long podcast? Like, do you have any advice on that as well? Like, where's like the BS meter to some extent?
Yeah, so I had this problem, as most people do when they're going down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, of how do you differentiate signal versus noise.
Yeah.
So I actually wrote a book that takes basically like the 50 most common concepts you might come across in Bitcoin. Call them mental models, call them heuristics, whatever you want. And not plugging my book, by the way, it's actually free if people want it.
Fair.
And the point is, so say someone like Michael Saylor will explain play by play the collapse of the Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
Great. If you have a memory like that, you can store all that information in your head.
Mm-hmm.
I can't do that. So if someone can offer you a simple rule or heuristic that is true most of the time, that you can fundamentally understand and then just apply it to every other situation, life gets a lot easier. So yeah, understanding these like very basic frameworks, like the Cantillon effect or how thermodynamics works, you will naturally sniff out BS very quickly.
Yeah.
And the faster you can do that, the quicker you can go in the direction you want to go without getting, pulled off course.
Yeah, it's a great point. You mentioned biographies. Is there any like one particular non-Bitcoin book that you recommend like everyone would read?
There are two.
Okay.
Actually, neither of them are biographies, but I love plugging these books.
Yeah.
Because they really helped me. One is called How Innovation Works. It's by Matt Ridley. He's written a number of other very popular books, The Rational Optimist, Red Queen. But this book about innovation, it will make it clear to you that humans will always innovate. There is no end in sight. We're always going to, concentrate on more denser sources of fuel or energy. We're always going to want harder and harder forms of money. We're always going to want to increase our standard of living, and people are always going to keep working on those problems. So that's never going to stop. There's never a point where you get to where, we can relax. Nothing's ever going to disrupt us.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you understand Bitcoin well enough, you kind of know like that's the end game for money.
Yeah.
But everything around it is going to continue to be disrupted.
Yep.
So that's the first book. Second is Energy and Civilization by Vaclav Smil. Most people coming into Bitcoin or, getting exposed to it for the first time don't understand energy at a fundamental level and how, accessing denser sources of energy and having more abundant energy links to quality of life and human prospering. From something as simple as a hand till in a field to a diesel-powered tractor and how that links to the increasing yield of crops, to then, reducing starvation. Like, there's so many clear linkages in how our lives get better, traced back to energy and energy systems. So yeah, two fundamental things I think everyone should understand, Bitcoin or not.
Nice. I like that. You brought up the idea of like, moving toward denser forms of energy, and then also like how technology is kind of accelerating at a rapid pace. How does that relate to Bitcoin? Like, does that mean like, the purchasing power of Bitcoin is going to be potentially like astronomical one day? Like, how do you think about that?
Again, Joe, people smarter than me to answer this question, but I am very optimistic on the potential of humans. Innovation, that's a very good point you bring up, that innovation occurs at an accelerating rate. There is a concept called the accelerating returns, because when you innovate, you're innovating on top of prior innovations. So you just keep stacking innovation on top of innovation, and that creates an accelerating curve. So if Bitcoin is capturing the prosperity generated by humans, and that prosperity we're generating is increasing, well, then the purchasing power of Bitcoin should increase as the main store of value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I want to dive further into your book, the Bitcoin Handbook, and the Treasury Sailor. So is that the second one? Is that one, or second one? That's your coming book, right?
Yeah, that hopefully will be out later this year.
And then the Bitcoin Handbook is the one that's out, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Can you kind of like walk us through like the main ideas of that book?
So it started as a newsletter. Basically, anytime I would come across a concept I didn't understand, I would write about it. I think that's the best way to understand anything. If you can't explain something in written form clearly, you do not understand that thing.
Yeah.
So it was an exercise in forcing myself to do that. Once I hit about 50 editions of this newsletter, each one tackling a different concept each week, people started hounding me like, hey, can I just buy the book of this? I don't want to read 50 newsletters.
Yeah.
So it was, people basically telling me, make this into a book. And then a publisher came along and said, yeah, we'll do that. So yeah, I had no interest in becoming an author. It just happened to me. And I hope it's been useful to people.
And when's your new book coming out?
Can't give a specific date.
Okay.
But hopefully by the end of 2025, it'll be out.
Okay. Nice.
And whenever it does come out, it will be completely free for people to download, share.
Nice. Cool. Well, I'll definitely be looking forward to seeing that one. This was actually a question, I think, from Twitter that someone wanted me to ask you. And I know you obviously don't give price predictions, so you don't have to go there. But a concept that people have been talking about is the idea of diminishing returns going forward. And, like Bitcoin, obviously, 2013, 2017 were massive cycles. And then 2021 was still a pretty good bull market, but it wasn't anything like those other two. Do you think that this cycle will be like, continue that trend of diminishing returns? Or do you think that we'll have another like massive parabolic bull run that might exceed the previous cycle?
There are a lot of forces at play which are completely over my head. All I know for sure is that Bitcoin will absolutely surprise you.
Yeah.
Now, that could be to the downside, but it can also be to the upside. And I think people in general are overly pessimistic. So when Bitcoin does outperform to the upside, it always leaves more people on the sidelines than it takes along for the ride, right? So if it gets to an exceptionally high price this cycle, I believe it'll be at a point where most people will disbelieve it could go higher. And for that reason, they will sell. They'll convince themselves, I'm going to sell the top, I'm going to buy the bottom, and they will miss that train. I don't know if it's this cycle, I don't know if it's next cycle, but it will absolutely happen at some point in the future.
Yeah, that's a good point. The topic of hyper Bitcoinization, like, do you think eventually it will come down to like there will be like one best money and that will be Bitcoin? Or do you think Bitcoin and dollars or other fiat currencies will coexist for a very long time?
So Elizabeth Stark gave a great talk yesterday where she was explaining a bit of what Lightning Labs have been doing. And as you know, anyone who holds Bitcoin and dollars side by side in a wallet or in a portfolio, over time it becomes very obvious which you want to have more of and which you want to have less of. So while they will probably continue to exist, any individual over time will naturally put more and more of their wealth into Bitcoin versus dollars.
Yeah, that's fair. And if you start with a small Bitcoin allocation, it will grow significantly more than your dollars, even if you aren't adding to it necessarily.
Yep.
I also want to ask you about like angel investing and capital allocation in Bitcoin. Like, I think a lot of like early Bitcoiners, like, we were talking to Trace Marin, like he's like, yeah, I bought Kraken and Armory and a few other Bitcoin companies, and it's like some of those did well, and then other investments, significantly underperformed Bitcoin. How do you think about that? Like when you could save Bitcoin and then also invest in other things, how do you think about that? How have you thought about that in the past, and how are you going to think about that going forward?
So I had a period where there were Bitcoin products and companies popping up. I was using their products and services. I was a huge fan of those things, and I wanted to invest in particular people. And so, became an accredited investor, talked to a number of angel investors in space, Lewis from Amises, who you previously worked with. And I was very green to angel investing. I think the first Bitcoin company I ever invested in was Umbrel. And I was so green that after talking to the founders, and they agreed to take me on because I had a portfolio of work showing that I understood Bitcoin, it was Bitcoin only, and I probably wasn't going to create any drama or hassles for them, And I think I asked them, okay, after I saw the deck and said I was in, I was like, okay, so how much money do I give you? Like, how does this work? So yeah, now I invested in about a dozen Bitcoin related companies, mostly seed stage. And yeah, over time, I'm very grateful to get to support products and services I love that I want to see exist. But it comes down to that fundamental point of how do you outperform Bitcoin as an investment? And that became clearer and clearer to me over time. And I realized I did not have an edge in this particular area. And when you do not have an edge in any field or area, you're better off just buying Bitcoin.
So initially you started out being not fairly aggressive, but you were investing in a lot of different things. And then now have you completely stopped angel investing?
Yeah, early on, I would work for a Bitcoin company. I would get to know the management team. I would see how their payroll works. What's the culture like?
Yeah.
And in most cases, as most Bitcoin companies take a very long-term view, you just be really impressed. You think, wow, this is incredible. Compared to like an average fiat TradFi company, this is exceptional. The people are exceptional. The mission is exceptional. The products are a high quality. I want to be part of this.
Mm-hmm.
And then you realize, oh, that's all Bitcoin companies. All Bitcoin companies hire exceptional people because there's such a huge competition for to get into them.
Yeah.
But yeah, over time, I realized, I don't have an edge in angel investing.
So I'm curious actually to hear your thoughts on this. Like the angel investments that you did made in those companies, like, do you have a goal of, what those like, obviously, you're not controlling the companies, they're going to do whatever they want, but do you hope that they go public? Do you hope that they get acquired? Like, obviously I would imagine you want to get your Bitcoin back to some extent, but maybe if they go public, then maybe they compromise like their core ethos potentially to some extent, or things like that. Like, how do you think about these different Bitcoin only companies like evolving over the next decade?
I think it's natural that some of them are going to go public. This cycle, we're seeing the capital markets open up to Bitcoin and Bitcoin related companies in a way that just hasn't been possible before.
Yeah.
Now you got to understand, if you started a Bitcoin specific business, let's say in 2015, so 10 years ago, and you bootstrapped that, like, you've probably lived a really hard life.
Yeah.
You've had to suffer through multiple cycles. You probably had to like remortgage your own home. You've probably had employees you've had to let go and then rehire and then maybe even let go again. Like, that is a hard ride for a founder. So if they get the opportunity to then, go public, I would never judge someone who's gone through that. They know more than I do.
Yeah.
But I think it's inevitable that more Bitcoin companies will be in the public markets. And there's also more public demand who want access to invest in, Bitcoin specific businesses.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, it makes sense from both sides.
I found it interesting that like a lot of the companies that are adopting Bitcoin as a treasury reserve asset that are publicly traded are like the zombie companies, right? Like Meta Planet had like one hotel, the Similar Scientific, other ones as well. It's like, if bad non-growing companies can do that strategy and absolutely crush it, like Meta Planet is like $1 billion company or multi-billion-dollar company at this point. To me, it seems like more Bitcoin startups should figure out a way to pursue that same route. Do you agree with that or disagree?
Yeah. I mean, there are obviously two clear routes you can take. You can be raising money from different pools of capital in order to buy Bitcoin in a way where that, debt is converted or the debt is non-convertible. I mean, non-callable. And you're primarily just taking existing capital, moving it through the eye of the needle, which is Bitcoin, and it's now on the other side. The other route is you're just building products and services. You have a cash flow positive business, and you're just sweeping those cash flows into Bitcoin. So two very, respectable routes to take. Because at the end of the day, like, you still have to maintain the trust of your shareholders. Like, if that disintegrates, it doesn't matter what strategy you're pursuing. You're done.
Yeah, that makes sense. Two more questions, then we can start to close it out. What's something that you believe that most Bitcoiners would disagree with?
Maybe it's not most Bitcoiners, but there is a growing movement around die with zero. Have you heard
Yeah.
about this?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's if you leave wealth to your children by the second or third generation, it's gone. So you may as well donate it while you're alive, and you've lived a great life. Maybe you've got your name on a building somewhere, whatever. My opinion is that comes from a world in which financial illiteracy is the norm. That's the default state. In a Bitcoin world, where opportunity cost is so obvious, I just think there's a greater incentive, and you see it with Bitcoiners teaching their kids about Bitcoin, which is really just teaching your kids about money and Austrian economics at an early age. I think you'll see wealth preserved by families over longer time horizons.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is something I maybe differ in opinion on, especially when you're thinking about giving money to a charity. Okay, how is that charity going to spend that money? What's the opportunity cost versus holding Bitcoin, or donating Bitcoin with the condition that they hold that Bitcoin for a certain time horizon?
Yeah.
What's going to benefit society more, or the community you're trying to help more?
Yeah, it's a great point. Last question. What do you think is the biggest risk to Bitcoin?
Okay, I'll talk on a personal level. My biggest risk to Bitcoin is my own stupidity. It's an unforced error.
Yeah.
You see it all the time. Maybe this goes back to reading enough biographies, is people say they do well in life. Maybe they have some success by following a very disciplined path and principles. And at some point, they kind of go off the rails. So it's, how do you maintain your sanity? How do you maintain your integrity? And, doing that will hopefully mean you don't lose your Bitcoin or believe you're smarter than Bitcoin.
Yeah.
In which case you end up with no Bitcoin.
Yeah. I like that. It's a great answer. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to record this. This was awesome.
Joe, thanks for having me. Keep it up.
Awesome. Thank you.